They laughed when she sold the horse for $1, but by the time the sun dipped behind the red hills, no one in Dust Creek was laughing anymore, and Ethan Cole would spend the rest of that day wondering why a woman like her had chosen a man like him, because nothing about that moment made sense. Not the way she held the reins like she was letting go of something sacred. Not the way the horse stood still as stone as if it understood more than any man there, and certainly not the way her eyes never left his face, steady, unblinking, like she had already made a decision long before she ever stepped into town. The wind carried dust low across the street, brushing against worn boots and hitching posts, while a few men leaned back in their chairs outside the saloon, smirking into their whiskey glasses, waiting for the joke to reveal itself. But it never did, because the woman didn't smile, didn't bargain, didn't even glance at anyone else. She simply placed the leather reins into Ethan's hand and said, quiet and clear, $1. And for a moment, even the wind seemed to hesitate. Ethan looked down at the horse, a strong chestnut with clean lines and steady breath, the kind of animal a man could ride for 100 miles without worry, and then back at her, trying to read something in her face, some hint of trick or desperation, but there was none. Only calm, only certainty, the kind that made a man uneasy without knowing why. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the last coin he had to his name, a single silver dollar worn thin at the edges, and something in him told him to walk away, to leave the whole strange moment behind, because deals like this didn't come without a cost. Not out here, not in a place where every favor had a shadow, but the way she stood there, unmoving, patient as the horizon, made it feel like the choice had already been made for him. He placed the coin in her palm, felt the brief warmth of her skin, and just like that, the horse was his, yet nothing about it felt like ownership, more like he had stepped into something he didn't understand. The men outside chuckled low, one of them muttering that he'd just bought himself trouble for cheap, but Ethan didn't answer, because the woman hadn't moved, not even after the coin changed hands. She simply stepped back, watching him, watching the horse, watching the space between them as if it mattered more than anything else in the world. You got your money, one man called out, amused. What are you waiting for? But she said nothing, and when Ethan finally turned to lead the horse away, he could feel it, the weight of her presence behind him. Not following too close, not too far, just there, like a shadow that chose its own distance. And as the sun climbed higher and the town slowly returned to its usual noise, Ethan realized something that settled deep in his chest like a quiet warning. He hadn't just bought a horse for $1. He had stepped into a story that had been waiting for him long before he ever arrived, and whatever it was, it wasn't finished yet. By the time Ethan reached the edge of town, the laughter behind him had faded into something quieter, something heavier, like the kind of silence that follows a question nobody wants to ask out loud. And still she was there, her footsteps soft against the dry earth, keeping the same distance, never closer, never farther, as if she had measured it down to the inch. He did not turn around at first, not because he had not noticed, but because he was not sure what he would see if he did. And out here a man learned to be careful with the things he chose to face. The horse moved steady beside him, calm in a way that did not match the unease building in his chest, its ears flicking back once or twice as if listening to her instead of him, and that alone was enough to make Ethan tighten his grip on the reins. After a quarter mile, he stopped, boots grinding lightly into the dirt, and finally turned, and there she was, standing in the open like she had nowhere else to be, the wind catching the loose strands of her dark hair, her eyes fixed on him with that same quiet certainty that had unsettled him back in town. You got your $1, he said, his voice even but low. That is where this ends. But she did not answer. Right away, only stepped forward once, then stopped again, respecting the space like it meant something more than distance. I know where it ends, she said finally, her English careful, each word placed like it mattered. But you do not. And that was the kind of answer that sat wrong in a man's mind, because it did not explain anything, it only opened more doors. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing toward the horizon where his small ranch sat another mile out, a place most men in Dust Creek had already written off as lost, a place he held onto out of habit more than hope, and for a moment he considered telling her to go back, to leave whatever strange purpose had brought her here behind, but something in the way she stood there made that feel like a mistake he would not understand until it was too late. He turned again without another word and started walking, and after a few seconds, he heard it, the same steady rhythm behind him, unhurried, unafraid. The land stretched wide around them, dry grass bending under a slow wind, fence posts leaning like tired men, and as they moved farther from town, the air seemed to settle into a kind of stillness that carried its own weight, the kind that made small sounds feel louder than they should, a boot against gravel, the quiet breath of a horse, the faint shift of fabric when she moved. When the ranch finally came into view, it looked the same as always, weathered wood, sagging porch, a place that had seen better days and did not expect better ones ahead, and Ethan paused at the gate, resting his hand on the rough post, because something about bringing her there felt like crossing a line he had not agreed to draw. He pushed the gate open anyway, the hinges groaning soft, and led the horse inside, and when he stepped onto the porch, he heard her stop just short of it. Just as she had stopped outside the distance, he had not spoken, but she had understood. And when he glanced back, she was already lowering herself to sit near the edge of the yard, not asking to come in, not expecting it, simply staying, like a watcher placed there by something older than either of them. Ethan stood there a long moment, keys in hand, staring at a door that had not mattered much until now, and for the first time in years, the quiet of his own home did not feel like peace. It felt like a question, and the answer was sitting out in the dust, waiting without asking, as if she knew he would come to it on his own. The sun had already begun its slow fall when Ethan finally stepped back out onto the porch, the wood creaking under his weight like it always did, but the sound felt sharper now, louder against the quiet that had settled over the land, and she was still there, exactly where he had left her, sitting near the edge of the yard with her hands resting loosely in her lap, not restless, not impatient, just present in a way that made time feel different around her. The horse stood a few yards away, head lowered, breathing slow and steady, and when Ethan looked at it, he noticed something he had not seen before, the way it kept angling its body toward her, not him, like it still belonged to her in ways that could not be handed over with a coin. He leaned against the porch post, arms crossing without thought, studying her the way a man studies a storm on the horizon, unsure if it is coming closer or simply waiting. "You planning to sit there all night?" he asked, not unkind, just tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day, and she lifted her eyes to him, calm as before, the fading light catching in them like something older than the land itself. "If that is what the night asks," she said, and again, it was not an answer meant to ease a man's mind. Ethan let out a breath through his nose, glancing out toward the fence line where the land stretched empty for miles, but something about that emptiness felt different now, like it had edges he had not noticed before, like it was being watched in return. He stepped down from the porch, boots sinking slightly into the dry earth, and walked halfway toward her before stopping, keeping that same invisible distance she had been honoring all day, because it felt important now, like crossing it without reason would break something he did not yet understand. "You do not have to stay," he said, quieter. This time, not as a command, more like a suggestion offered to the wind, and for a moment she did not respond, her gaze drifting past him toward the house, the barn, the fence posts leaning under years of weather, taking it all in as if measuring it against something only she could see. "I know," she said at last, and there was no defiance in it, only certainty, the kind that made a man realize she had already considered every choice before he ever spoke. The light shifted lower, shadows stretching long across the yard, and a chill began to slip into the air, the kind that came quick once the sun dropped behind the hills, and Ethan rubbed a hand along the back of his neck, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones, but also something else, something quieter, like the sense that the land itself was holding its breath. The horse lifted its head then, ears turning sharply toward the far ridge, and Ethan followed its gaze, squinting into the dimming distance, but he saw nothing, only the rolling line of earth and sky meeting in a blur of fading gold. Yet the stillness that followed was not empty, it was full, like something unseen had just passed through and chosen not to show itself. He looked back at her, and for the first time, he saw it, not in her words, not in her stillness, but in the way her posture had shifted just slightly, alert now, grounded in a way that spoke of readiness without fear. And it struck him, then, that she was not waiting for something to happen. She was already prepared for it. "What are you staying for?" he asked, the question finally finding its way out, and this time she did not hesitate, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that felt heavier than anything she had said before. "For what is already coming," she replied, and the wind moved again, low and slow across the land, carrying with it a quiet that no longer felt like peace but like the space before something changes, and Ethan stood there, the last light of day, slipping away, realizing that whatever he thought he had brought home that afternoon, it was not a horse, and it was not a coincidence. It was something that had arrived with purpose, and it had no intention of leaving. The night came down slow over the land, not sudden, not harsh, but steady like a curtain being drawn by careful hands, and Ethan could feel it settling into the bones of the ranch, into the wood beneath his boots, into the spaces between breaths. And still she had not moved from where she sat, her silhouette now just a darker shape against the dim earth, as if the fading light had chosen to leave her last. He lit a lantern near the porch, the flame flickering soft behind the glass, casting a warm circle that did not quite reach her, and for a moment he considered calling her closer, offering a place inside, but something in the way she held her ground told him she would not accept it, not because she could not, but because she had already decided where she belonged tonight. The horse shifted again, a quiet step in the dirt, its head lifting toward the darkened ridge like it had before, and Ethan followed its gaze once more, narrowing his eyes, trying to make sense of a horizon that now felt less empty than it should have been, like something was there just beyond sight, not approaching, not retreating, simply existing with intention. He stepped off the porch again, slower this time, stopping halfway between the house and where she sat, the lantern light catching only part of his face, leaving the rest in shadow, and for a long second neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that did not need filling, because it was already saying enough. "You said something is coming," he finally said, his voice low, careful not to carry too far into the open land, and she looked up at him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper now, more focused, like the night had brought clarity instead of uncertainty. "It has been coming for a long time," she answered, and there was no fear in it, only truth, plain and steady, the kind that does not ask to be believed. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the dry ground crunching under his boot, and glanced back at the house, at the worn boards and sagging roof that had stood against years of wind and weather, but now seemed smaller somehow, less certain in its place against whatever unseen thing was drawing closer. "Then why here?" he asked, not accusing, not demanding, just needing something to hold on to, and she rose slowly to her feet, brushing the dust from her hands, her movements quiet and deliberate, like every step carried meaning beyond itself. She walked a few paces, not toward him, not away, but to a spot where the yard met the open land, and she stood there looking out into the darkness, her posture straight, grounded, like she was part of the land itself. "Because this is where it will end," she said, and the words settled into the air between them, heavier than the night, heavier than the silence. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant earth, and Ethan felt it brush against his face like a warning he could not quite hear, his eyes drifting again to the ridge, and this time, though he could not see anything clearly, he felt it, the presence, not close, not immediate, but certain, like a shadow cast before the object itself. "Appears." He looked back at her, standing there unmoved, and for the first time since she had entered his life that afternoon, he understood something simple and unsettling. She had not come here by chance, and she had not stayed because she had nowhere else to go. She had come because this place, his place, was tied to something larger than he had ever known, and she intended to stand between him and whatever that something was. The lantern flickered behind him, the light shifting just enough to stretch their shadows long across the yard, two figures standing apart but connected by something unseen, and as the night deepened around them, Ethan realized that whatever had begun with a single coin in the dust, it was no longer about a trade. It was about a line being drawn in the quiet, and whether he understood it or not, he was already standing on one side of it. The hours stretched long after the last light disappeared, and the ranch settled into a silence that felt too deliberate to be natural, like the land itself was listening instead of sleeping, and Ethan remained on the porch longer than he meant to, watching her stand at the edge of the yard, unmoving, her figure barely touched by the lantern glow, yet somehow more solid than anything around her. The horse had not wandered far, choosing instead to remain within a few yards of her, its presence calm but alert, as if it understood a role Ethan had not been told about, and that alone kept him from going inside, because something about leaving her out there alone did not sit right anymore. Not after the way she had spoken. Not after the way the air itself seemed to shift around her. He stepped down again, slower now, his boots careful on the dry ground, closing the distance by a few more feet, not enough to cross that invisible line, but enough to feel the quiet more clearly, and when he stopped, he noticed something he had missed before, faint markings in the dirt near where she stood, not footprints exactly, but patterns, deliberate and subtle, like someone had traced meaning into the ground without disturbing it too much. "You've been here before," he said, more statement than question, his eyes following the faint lines that curved outward toward the open land, and she did not deny it, only lowered her gaze briefly to the earth beneath her feet before lifting it again to the dark horizon. "Not here," she replied softly, "but somewhere like this." And again, it was not an answer that closed anything, only one that widened the space around it. The wind shifted again, brushing past them with a low sound that carried across the dry grass, and Ethan felt it against his neck. Cooler now, carrying something he could not name, not danger exactly, but awareness, like being seen from a distance too far to measure. He rubbed his hands together slowly, more out of habit than cold, and glanced once more toward the ridge, and this time, though the darkness held its shape, he could have sworn the line of the horizon was not as still as it had been before, as if something had moved just enough to change the way the shadows rested. "You expect me to just stand here and wait?" he asked, his voice quieter now, not challenging, just searching, and she turned her head slightly toward him, the movement small but intentional. "No," she said, "I expect you to stay," and there was a difference in those words that settled deeper than he liked, because waiting meant uncertainty, but staying meant choice. Ethan let out a slow breath, looking back at the house, the barn, the pieces of a life he had built one quiet day at a time, and for the first time he wondered if that life had been leading to this moment all along, if every mile, every decision, had brought him to a place where he would have to decide whether to turn away or stand his ground beside someone he did not fully understand. The lantern flickered behind him again, the flame bending slightly as the wind moved through, casting longer shadows across the yard, and when he looked back at her, he noticed her stance had shifted once more, not tense, not afraid, but ready in a way that made the air feel tighter, more focused, like a line drawn across the night that something would soon have to cross. The horse let out a low breath, steady but aware, and Ethan felt it then, not in his eyes, not in his ears, but somewhere deeper. A quiet certainty that whatever she had been waiting for, whatever had been coming, it was closer now, not visible, not yet, but present in the way the world had gone still around them. He stepped forward one more pace, just enough that the space between them felt shared instead of separate, and he did not say anything else, because there was nothing left to ask that would change what was already unfolding. And as the night held steady and the land stretched wide and silent under the stars, Ethan Cole realized that staying was no longer something he was being asked to do. It was something he had already chosen, even if he had not said it out loud. The night deepened until the sky turned wide and endless above them, scattered with stars that seemed too sharp, too clear, as if the world had been stripped down to only what mattered, and Ethan stood there beside her without realizing how long he had been still, his breath slow, his senses stretched thin across the quiet, because something in that silence no longer felt empty, it felt occupied, like the land itself was holding a presence just out of reach. The lantern behind him flickered again, weaker now, its glow shrinking as the oil burned low, and in that dimming light, the lines she had traced in the dirt became more visible, faint but deliberate, forming a shape he could not quite understand, something circular, something that seemed to hold the space around them rather than mark it, and he crouched slightly, eyes narrowing as he studied it, trying to make sense of a language he had never been taught. "This is not for you to read," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm. And he looked up at her, not startled, just aware that she had been watching him the entire time, noticing what he noticed, understanding what he did not. "Then why draw it here?" he asked, straightening slowly, and she turned her gaze back toward the open land, toward that same ridge that had held their attention since the sun went down. "So it knows where to stop," she answered, and there was a weight to that sentence that settled deeper than any explanation could have, because it implied something moving, something approaching, something that recognized boundaries even if he did not. Ethan followed her gaze again, and this time, though the darkness still held its shape, he felt it more clearly, a shift, not in sight but in sense, like the air had changed direction without wind, like something unseen had drawn closer by inches instead of miles, and the horse reacted before he did, lifting its head sharply, ears forward, body still but alert, not afraid, just aware in a way that matched her. He swallowed once, slow, his throat dry though the night had cooled, and he found himself stepping just a little closer to her, not enough to break whatever line she had set, but enough to feel less alone inside that growing awareness, and she did not move away, did not acknowledge it, but the space between them felt different now, shared instead of divided. "You knew this would happen tonight," he said, not accusing, not even surprised anymore, just stating what had become clear, and she nodded once, small and certain, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "I knew it would come," she said. "I did not know if you would stay." And there it was again, that quiet emphasis on choice, on the part he played in something larger than himself. And Ethan let that settle for a moment, feeling the weight of it not as pressure, but as something steadier, something that asked for presence rather than action. The wind moved again, softer now, but carrying a sound with it, not a voice, not a step, but something in between, like the land itself shifting its breath, and Ethan felt it pass through him like a memory he could not place, something distant, something that tugged at the edges of his mind without forming into words. He glanced at her again, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something beneath her calm, not fear, not doubt, but recognition, like she was seeing something she had seen before, something she had been waiting to meet again. "What is it?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost lost in the open air, and she did not answer right away, her posture grounding deeper into the earth beneath her feet, her presence becoming something more than stillness, something rooted, like she was no longer just standing on the land but part of it. When she finally spoke, her voice carried that same quiet certainty, but now it held something else, something closer to truth than anything she had said before. "It is a debt," she said, and the words settled between them heavier than the night, heavier than the silence, because it was not his, not yet, but somehow, he knew it would be, and as the stars stretched above them and the darkness pressed in without closing, Ethan Cole realized that whatever had followed her here, whatever had been drawn to this place, it was not coming to take, it was coming to claim something that had been left unfinished, and whether he understood it or not, he was already standing inside it. The word lingered in the air long after she spoke it, settling into the quiet like dust that refused to fall, and Ethan felt it in a way he could not explain, not as something heard, but as something remembered, like a piece of a story he had once lived through and then buried under years of distance and routine. He shifted his stance slightly, boots pressing deeper into the dry earth, and looked out toward the ridge again. And this time the darkness did not feel like a single thing, it felt layered, like shapes moving behind shapes, not fast, not threatening, just deliberate, like something that had all the time in the world. The horse let out a low breath, steady but heavier now, its body angled fully toward that distant line, and Ethan noticed how it did not step back, did not retreat, it simply stood, as if it understood that leaving was no longer part of the choices available. A debt to who? Ethan asked, his voice quieter than before, not because he was afraid, but because. The night seemed to demand less noise, less interruption, and she turned her head slightly toward him, her eyes catching a trace of starlight that made them seem deeper than they were. To you? She said, and that was the first time her answer pointed directly at him, not around him, not past him, but to him, and it settled into his chest with a weight that made him still completely. Ethan frowned slightly, not in disbelief, but in confusion that carried something else beneath it, something closer to recognition than he was ready to admit. I have never seen you before, he said, and even as the words left his mouth, they felt incomplete, like they were missing something that had not yet reached the surface. She nodded once, as if she expected that answer, as if it had already been accounted for long before he spoke it. No, she said softly, but you saw me. And that distinction hung there between them, subtle but sharp, the difference between knowing and remembering. The wind moved again, slower now, brushing through the dry grass with a sound that almost resembled a whisper, and Ethan felt something stir in his mind. Not a clear image, not a full memory, just a fragment, a flicker of cold air, of smaller hands gripping his sleeve, of a night that had felt just as still as this one. He blinked once, his gaze shifting briefly away from the ridge as if trying to catch that thought before it disappeared. But it slipped just out of reach, leaving behind only the sense that it had been real. You said it would end here, he said, his voice steadier now, grounding himself in what he could hold on to, and she turned fully toward him this time, her posture unchanged, but her presence sharper, more defined, like the moment itself had drawn a line through everything that came before it. It will, she answered, and then, after a brief pause, she added, because this is where you chose it. And that word again, chose, settled deeper than the rest, because it suggested something he had done, something he had decided, even if he could not remember doing it. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath visible now in the cooler air, and looked back toward the land he had lived on. For years without question, without doubt, and for the first time, he wondered if this place had always been more than just ground and sky, if it had been holding on to something, waiting for a moment like this to return. The lantern behind him flickered one last time, the flame shrinking lower, casting longer shadows that stretched toward the open land, and as the darkness deepened, Ethan felt it clearly now, not fear, not danger, but arrival, something crossing a distance that could not be measured in miles, something that had found its way back to this place, to this moment, to him, and beside him. She did not move, did not step forward or back. She simply stood, steady as the earth beneath her feet, as if she had always known exactly when this would happen, and exactly where she needed to be when it did. The memory did not come all at once. It never does. It arrived the way the night had, slow and certain, pressing in from the edges until there was no space left to ignore it, and Ethan felt it first in his hands, the phantom weight of something smaller, lighter, clinging to him, then in the cold, sharp and biting, a wind that cut through bone and breath alike, and suddenly the ridge in front of him was no longer just a line in the dark. It was a place he had stood before, years ago, when the world had been narrower, when survival was measured in steps and instinct instead of thought. He blinked once, but the present did not push the memory away this time. It stayed, clearer now, a shape forming out of the fragments, a small figure against the ground, barely moving, wrapped in something too thin for the cold, eyes wide not with fear, but with a quiet that had struck him. Even then, he had not asked questions that night, had not waited for reasons, he had only acted, lifting that small body without knowing who it belonged to, without knowing what it might cost him, only knowing that leaving it there was not an option. The air around him now felt the same, that same stillness, that same weight pressing against the moment, and he turned slowly toward her, the pieces finally aligning in a way that made sense not to his mind, but to something deeper, something older. You were there, he said, and it was not a question, because it could not be, not anymore, and she met his gaze without surprise, without hesitation, only with that same steady presence she had carried from the moment she stepped into his life. I was, she answered, her voice softer now, not weaker, just closer to the truth than before, and the night seemed to hold that exchange like it mattered, like it had been waiting for those words to finally exist. Ethan ran a hand slowly over the back of his neck, his breath steady but heavier, not from fear, but from the weight of understanding settling into place, because that night had not been something he carried with him, it had been something he had left behind, something he had not expected to return. I did not stay, he said quietly, the realization coming with a kind of calm that surprised him, because he remembered now the urgency, the need to move, to get back, to survive another day. He had left her where the land turned gentler, where he believed she would be found, where he told himself it was enough. She shook her head once, slow, deliberate, her eyes never leaving his, and in that motion there was no blame, no accusation, only correction. You stayed long enough, she said, and those words carried more weight than anything she had said before, because they did not measure what he had done. They defined it. They gave it meaning beyond what he had allowed himself to see. The wind moved again, softer. Now, and the tension in the air shifted with it, not gone, but changed, like something that had reached its point and no longer needed to press forward. Ethan looked back toward the ridge, and this time the darkness did not feel like something approaching. It felt like something pausing, something that had reached a boundary and chosen not to cross it, and he understood then, not in words, but in the way the land settled around them, that whatever had followed her here, whatever had been tied to that unfinished moment from years ago, it had come to see if it still held, if the line he had drawn without knowing still stood. He glanced down at the faint markings in the dirt, the circle she had traced, and for the first time he saw it not as a symbol, but as a boundary, something that held the space between what was and what had been, and she had placed it here not to keep something out, but to show where it must stop. So the debt, he said, his voice quieter now, not searching, just acknowledging, and she nodded once, her posture easing just slightly, as if something inside her had shifted now that the truth had been spoken aloud. It is not yours, she said, it is mine, and the meaning settled into the air between them with a clarity that left no room for doubt, because she had not come to collect anything from him, she had come to protect what he had given without knowing, to stand between him and whatever might have claimed that unfinished past. The horse lowered its head again, the tension easing from its stance, and the night, for the first time since it had fallen, felt less like a held breath and more like something that could finally move again, slow and steady, carrying the weight of what had passed without needing to hold on to it any longer. And Ethan stood there beside her, not as a man who had bought something for $1, but as someone who had unknowingly set a line years ago that still held strong enough to shape the present, and beside him, she remained, not because she had to, but because she had chosen to see it through until the end. The night did not break when it ended. It loosened, slowly, like a grip that had held too long and finally chose to let go, and Ethan felt it in the way the air shifted first, softer, lighter, no longer pressing against his chest, and the land, which had stood so still for hours, began to breathe again, quiet and steady, like it had been waiting for something to pass. He stood there without moving, his eyes drifting once more toward the ridge, but the weight that had lingered there was gone now, not vanished, just resolved, like a story that had reached its final line and no longer needed to be told again. And beside him, she remained for a moment longer, her posture easing in a way so subtle most men would have missed it, but Ethan saw it, because he was looking now, really looking, not at a stranger who had followed him home, but at someone who had carried a promise across years and miles without asking for anything in return. The horse shifted closer to her one last time, brushing its head lightly against her shoulder, and she raised a hand to rest against its neck, fingers still, grounded, as if closing something that had been open far too long, and then she stepped back, not away from him, but away from the space she had been holding all night, the line she had drawn in the dirt still faintly visible under the soft gray of approaching dawn. Ethan watched her, the first pale light touching the horizon behind her, turning the edges of the world from shadow into shape, and he felt something settle in him that had not been there before, not relief exactly, not understanding fully, but something steadier, something that did not need explanation to exist. "You could have told me," he said quietly, not as a complaint, just as a truth that had found its place too late to matter, and she looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time there was something in her expression that resembled a smile, not wide, not bright, just present, like a moment shared rather than given. "You would not have remembered," she said, and there was no sadness in it, only acceptance, because some things were not meant to be held in words, only in the way they shaped what came after. The light grew a little stronger, enough to stretch their shadows back toward the house, long and thin across the dry ground, and Ethan noticed then that the markings she had drawn were already beginning to fade, the wind brushing them into nothing, like they had only ever been there for the night, like they had done what they were meant to do. She turned after that, slow and certain, walking toward the open land without hesitation, without looking back, and the horse followed her after a single pause, its steps quiet but sure, as if it had always known which direction it would go when this was over, and Ethan did not call out, did not step forward, because something in him understood that this was not a leaving, not in the way most endings are. It was a closing, a circle finished exactly where it had begun. He stood there until the sun broke fully over the ridge, warming the boards beneath his boots, lighting the yard in a way that made it look smaller, simpler, like nothing extraordinary had ever touched it, but he knew better now, because the quiet felt different, not empty, not waiting, just settled, like something had been returned to its proper place. When he finally moved, it was only to step down into the yard, to where the faintest trace of that circle had been, and he looked at the ground for a long moment, then lifted his gaze out toward the distance where she had disappeared, the land stretching wide and open as it always had, and yet not the same. He reached into his pocket without thinking and found nothing there, the coin long gone, but the weight of it remained in a way he could not measure, not as a cost, not as a loss, but as something given and returned in ways that did not need to be counted, and as the morning settled in around him, Ethan Cole understood one simple thing that did not need to be spoken aloud. Out here, a man does not always know the moment his life changes. Sometimes it happens quiet, with no witness but the land itself, and sometimes all it takes is a single $1 and someone who refuses to leave until the debt is paid.